And one of the other things, I can attempt to draw you a quick picture here. We don't want a timer. So one of the things, and we'll say this one here is SharePoint 2010 and prior, so this is also true of 2007, and SQL 2008, SQL 2008 R2 and before. Basically what you would do is you would come over here and you would set up your SSRS database, and that would be in SharePoint integrated mode. Okay, and then over here we would have our SharePoint farm. Okay, so we'd have SharePoint. So we might have a couple of servers in here, you know, database servers, PowerPivot, whatever that may be, and then a bunch of site collections. So we've got our SharePoint farm and our reporting services server. And then over here we've got a third little area, and we'll just call this our data store. And this one might have, you know, 4 or 5 different databases on it. We might have in here the AdventureWorks, for instance. Oops, not words, AdventureWorks. So in 2008, when you set up reporting services here, you went through that central administration page in the general setting like I showed you there. And essentially what would happen is I would send a request from my SharePoint side. I'd click on a link to open a report. It would go up here to my reporting services server here. It would hit that. It would see which server or which report and everything it was. It would go over here to my AdventureWorks database. It would get my data. And then it would bring it back over here to reporting services, which would then tell it to send the data back to SharePoint. So we kind of had this, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, we had to go a bunch of different places in order just to run one single report. What happened, however, with SharePoint 2010 and SQL 2012, this got greatly simplified. You know, now we just have SharePoint, and we have our data store. So what ended up happening now, so we'll say the same thing, AdventureWorks. So now, essentially, rather than having to go up to reporting services and it tell us where to go get the data from, we can go straight over here and then straight back to SharePoint. So you end up eliminating the middleman, so you actually get quite a good performance increase between reporting services in integrated mode in 2010 with 2008 R2 and SharePoint 2010 with SQL 2012, since you can just integrate that service application right into SharePoint. So that is essentially what this reporting services application here is going to do for you. And like I said, if you don't have this on the 2012 backend, that option won't even be on the list here. So we'll just go down the list here. I'll talk to you guys real quick about each one of these. Like I said, PowerPivot, we'll talk a little bit more about that one. The Excel services application is required in order to use the PowerPivot service application. So if you guys have ever used PowerPivot for Excel, you'll know by the name I just said that it's integrated right into Excel. And that's no different in the browser, really. It's going to do some other stuff in the background, but once you deploy that to SharePoint, it's really just rendering that Excel sheet inside my browser. And Excel services is going to be what makes that happen. So anytime that you open up an Excel sheet and it opens inside the browser, that's really Excel services doing all that work. And what this is going to do is it's going to basically put a little Excel engine on your server and allow you to open up Excel sheets. So the nice thing about this, there's all kinds of settings inside of here. The one that you're really going to want to pay attention to is going to be this application ID down here for this unattended service account. So the unattended service account is going to be very important, which we'll talk about here in a second. The other very important setting that you'll want to look at inside of here is this trusted file location. Excuse me, this trusted file location here. So if your Excel sheet's not stored in a trusted file location, Excel services essentially can't see it. So by default, it's going to be set to HTTP and all children. If your website's on using secure HTTP, so HTTPS, by default this is not going to work. You'll have to come in here and say add trusted file location, tell it you want to use HTTPS, and then tell it you want to trust all children, and then come down here and click OK at the very bottom. Okay, so there's a lot of settings inside of here. Obviously, we don't have time to go over all these. There is actually very good documentation out there on MSDN about how to set up each one of these service applications. So I really want to spend more time showing you guys these things in action rather than sitting here talking about how to configure each one of these. So that's essentially what your Excel services application is going to do, though. Render Excel sheets in the browser, whether that's just a pure Excel workbook or whether that happens to be a PowerPivot workbook that's deployed out to SharePoint. Essentially, it still needs to open up in Excel. Performance point, you'll notice a lot of these settings are very similar to each other. So you saw before we have trusted content locations this time instead of trusted file locations. We did have trusted data locations before, or data providers rather. And then again, you know, the performance point application here, that all important unattended service account. Okay, so if we come back here to our service applications again, and again, performance point, which I'll show you guys here in a minute, is going to allow you to take all your current BI stuff and essentially render some cool reporting in the browser. So performance point is really a reporting application for SharePoint, essentially. And then finally, the last one we'll look at inside of here before we actually get into a demo here is this secure source service. So I mentioned that that one was very, very important to you. The reason for that is this is going to be what allows each of these service applications, in this case Performance Point and PowerPivot, to actually access data. So without getting into all kinds of security stuff around Kerberos and web authentications, that I'll be 100% honest with you guys, I'm not a Kerberos guy. Again, that's one of our South Africa guys. If you check out one of their webinars, they might have some stuff in there that would explain that a little bit further. But essentially, the account that we assign to this, if we check the box here and then say set credentials, it's going to allow me to actually input a username and password here. And what that's going to do is anytime Performance Point needs to access the data source, it's going to use these credentials that we just set. So when I log in, it's not going to use Brad's credentials, or it's not going to use the administrator credentials here that I'm using right now. It's actually going to use whichever credentials I tell it to do here. So what that does is, rather than saying, you know, I've got 150 people that are going to need to access this Performance Point dashboard, rather than you going in and giving each one of those 150 direct access to your database or direct access to your cube or reporting server,